Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to the newspaper review. I am Tony, and I'll be taking you through this segment. First, we'll start with the New Telegraph. Boldly written on page 3 and page 4 of the newspaper. Alleged coup. Accused officers to be arraigned. Take plead May 8, coming from investigation. At the top of the newspaper, 13% derivation, poor oil production dips allocation by 16.79% to 227.79 billion naira. You see that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, primary deadline. NDC woos Obi Kwankwaso with presidential tickets. You see that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 3 and page 5. Ibadan Summit. PDP defends Makinde over Wetai comments. You see that on page 3 and page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 8. Adeleke approves implementation of ASU FGN part for Uni Osun. You get it on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Washington shooting. Gunman plan to target top Trump officials, coming from Attorney General. You get it on page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 14 and 16, 2027 polls. Concerns over federal government's 135 billion naira budget for litigation. Then in page 2 of the newspaper as well, Syrup. Editors use NBC over threat to sanction broadcasters for expressing opinions. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom on page 4, aviation crisis. Carriers insist on shutdown as meeting with federal government ends in deadlock. Then on page 9, 10, and 11 of the newspaper, 2027 mix grill for second-term governors. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. Boldly written in page 3 and page 4 of the newspaper, crisis in public hospital worsens. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 25, delay flights as jet fuel shortage deepens. Then on page 38 of the newspaper, aviation fuel hike. Stakeholder seeks government intervention to save 2027 hijack. In page 11 of the newspaper, Sule's gamble. APC emanates loss in Nasarawa State. At the bottom of the newspaper, Nigeria's face rising threat in South Africa. Ask federal government to act. You can see that on page 5 of the newspaper. Then on page 8 of the newspaper, underwear display, political campaign hits new low in Kano. Then on page 33 of the newspaper, Sokoto onion farmer lose 10,000 bags to fire in 1 week. Still in the same newspaper on page 6, Abuja's chaotic transport system drills residents. Away from that newspaper to the blueprint. Boldly written on page 8 of the newspaper, APC PDP rally against Makinde over call for Operation Wetai. NDLEA seizes Captagon. Suspect excrete 45 cocaine pellets in Kwara State. Still in the same newspaper on business on page 24, Nigeria benefiting from crude oil price rise. Outlook strengthened. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 10, how NAF airstrikes destroy terrorist hideout in Northeast, coming from spokesman. Still in the same newspaper, Vanguard Image Maker Award call to do more for Nigerians, coming from Idris. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On page 6 of the newspaper, boldly written, 2027 NDC offers Obi Kwankwaso joint ticket. At the top of the newspaper on page 6 as well, PDP factions clash over Makinde's Ibadan speech. Then in page 2 of the newspaper, where you continue reading, CBN tightens news, mops up 2.8 trillion naira from banks. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, no fresh tax on vehicles coming from federal government. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. Then on page 21 of the newspaper, this one is coming from Marketers Freaked. Fuel price hike feared as Trump cancels second Iran meeting. Then on page 28 of the newspaper, Varsity VC laments high rate of ritualists in Nigeria, warns students. Moving away from that newspaper to the Matrix, on page 2 of the newspaper, boldly written, APC, opposition in war of words. At the top of the newspaper on page 2, at the top of the newspaper on page 3, crushing web of tax, levies, charges by NCAA, FAAN, NAMA choking airlines, profitability coming from CPPC. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of the newspaper, Funke Akindele denies snubbing Pasuma, calls viral clip misleading. You get that on page 23 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 3, Syrup, NGE, sue NBC over threat to sanction broadcasters for expressing opinions. Moving away from that newspaper to the Punch, boldly written on page 2, PDP ADC blogs reject joint presidential ticket. At the top of the newspaper on page 28, coming from Obasanjo, NNPC refineries will never work again. Still in the same newspaper on page 39, airlines plan Thursday shutdown. Still in the same newspaper on page 44, Atiku warns against suspending campaigns in Borno, Benue, and other states. Still in the same newspaper on page 7, how power struggles threaten Ondo APC's unity. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 44, INEC Gamba recognition sparks fresh SDP rule. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom, another UK-based Nigerian found dead at workplace. Together on page 4 of the newspaper, YOAU declined venue for Peter Obi lecture coming from management. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian, on page 6 of the newspaper, boldly written, banks grapple with asset quality validation test after 4.65 trillion naira capital. At the top of the newspaper, APC crisis fester as 5 states face exclusion from primaries convention. You see that on page 3 of the newspaper. Ground handlers may suspend operations over airlines. 9 billion naira debts. You see that on page 5 of the newspaper. Alleged coup plot. Detained Colonel sues federal government, demands 500 million naira damages. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. Backlash over Alausa's stand on social science courses amid widening job crisis. Backlash over Alausa's stand on social science courses amid widening job crisis. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. LASG signs power purchase agreements with 3 IPP firms. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Cracks, hurdles in united opposition hand APC strategic edge ahead of 2027. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 2, group predicts APC likely to lose in Nasarawa. Still in the same newspaper on page 14, Police Smart raises 13 billion naira from commercial paper to improve industrial agenda. Moving away from that newspaper to the Hope newspaper, boldly written on page 3, Ondo APC denies imposition plot. On top of the newspaper, state police proposal gains traction. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 3 as well, bank customers lament hike in ATM card cost, seek CBN's intervention. Still in the same newspaper on page 2, Iswa zone demands APC assembly ticket. Still in the same newspaper on page 2, Akure Ward 8 endorses Dare Aliu for rep seat. Still in the same newspaper on page 7, world leaders react, condemn attempted killing of President Trump. World leaders react, condemn attempted killing of President Trump. You see that on page 7 of the newspaper. Then on page 23 of the newspaper, Lagos maintains COVID-19 vigilance, strengthens infection control. You see that on page 23 of the newspaper. Lagos maintains COVID-19 vigilance, strengthens infection control. Moving away from that newspaper to the leadership newspaper, boldly written press statements by the Kwara state government. On top of the newspaper, aviation fuel crisis threatens 2026 Hajj airlift, stakeholders warn. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Then on page 10 of the newspaper, Turaki-led PDP kicks as APC, Wike faction accuses Makinde of inciting comment. Moving away from that newspaper to the First Daily, boldly written, Syrup editors drag NBC over sanction threat. At the top of the newspaper, trap in crossfire, Abuja Corps members killed as gun battle erupts. Trap in crossfire, Abuja Corps member killed as gun battle erupts. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of the newspaper, APC mocks opposition over Ibadan summit. Nigerian Navy deploys warships, air assets for Gulf of Guinea drill. Still in the same newspaper, NRS dismisses fake vehicle tax notice, warns public. Still in the same newspaper, resident doctors suspend strike after government assurances on arrears. Still in the same newspaper, Mali defense minister killed as fresh clashes escalate. Babajide Sanwo-Olu signs new power deals, introduces performance coming from base model. That's it on today's edition of Newspaper Review. Many thanks for watching. I am Cassie Tony. Do well to join us next time for more breaking news. Do have a lovely day.